Hi, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 7. In today's lecture, I'm going to be continuing the geologic history of Antarctica and of the world, and also the history of the plants and animals found on the continents during that time. Last class, I started with a general discussion of fossils and then went on to early life and went through a number of geologic history events through the Great Permian extinction, and that's where we're going to pick up today. After the Permian extinction comes the Mesozoic era, or the dinosaur era, and then we'll talk about Antarctica as it gradually made its transition from forests to the polar wasteland during the Age of Mammals, the Cenozoic era, which is actually the era of geologic time that we are presently living in. Pictured here is a genus of tree, Nothofagus, that still survives in Australia, but used to live in Antarctica as well. And in the early Age of Mammals, fossils of this plant are found. Antarctica was cooler by that point, but still habitable. The last subject that I'm going to be covering before the midterm is ecology and biodiversity in Antarctica. And the discussion of how Antarctica got cold, which is what will occupy the first half of this lecture today, or first part of this lecture, will then transition into talking a little bit about the terrestrial biodiversity that has survived in Antarctica, as sparse as it is. I'll have more on what this creature is later, this Antarctodon mammal. But in the meantime, a quick reminder that the third lab on plate tectonics is due on Friday. It is, aside from the presentation that the TAs made, I would recommend reviewing Lecture 5 on geology and plate tectonics. I'll also say that the review session that I recorded on January 25th covers a lot of this material. Also, if you would like to, the first reading assignment is due on February 14th, and it's open. You can find it either under the Assignments tab on Gaucho Space, or you can find it under Week 6, or under the little module for Week 6, Glaciers. And the midterm is going to be opening next Monday and closing the Sunday afterwards, Sunday, February 7th at 11:59 p.m. So let's talk a little bit about the midterm. This we will be having a lot more review, but this is an overview of what the midterm is going to be like. It's very much going to be like the previous lecture quiz you took, but it's going to be longer and there aren't going to be any short answer questions. So it's only going to be multiple choice and true or false questions that are going to be automatically graded. So it will open on Monday, February 1st. However, that same day, I will be releasing the final lecture that contains any new material that will be covered on the midterm, Lecture 8, which will be about marine wildlife and ecology in Antarctica. And you definitely want to wait to take the exam until you've seen that. So I will be posting that on Monday, and that will be the last lecture of new material I release before the midterm. The exam is going to consist of 50 questions, and you'll have 75 minutes to complete your attempt. So what is covered? Lectures 2 through 8. Remember that Lecture 1 is just introductory material, and that's not something I'm testing you on. The other thing you want to consider is that I would like you to have read all of the supplementary readings and movies I've posted on Gaucho Space. So that includes the climate and paleontology articles that you see listed under the folders on Gaucho Space, as well as the clips of Frozen Planet and Walking with Dinosaurs that I've had you watch. There is also an excerpt of March of the Penguins that I'd like you to watch relatively soon after you finish, around the same time as you complete Lecture 8 next week. And the thing is, none of these are going to be very heavily tested on, but I will say that reading the articles and watching the clips will likely help you understand concepts that you've learned in lecture, and I may reference them briefly. So they're not going to be a heavy focus of the exam, but they are definitely going to be relevant, and I want you to have seen the excerpts and read the articles. One thing I'll say is that I normally, in the description of the movie itself on Gaucho Space, I list what you have to watch. I will actually be posting a study guide later this week. That study guide is going to contain a list of key terms found throughout the lectures, sorted by topic. And if you find yourself not knowing what some of those terms mean, then it's a good time to find the relevant lecture and try to find it. You can even just use the search function in PowerPoint and be like, where did she talk about albedo, for example? Or where did she talk about Antarctic dinosaurs? And I will be doing some review. On Monday, February 1st, I will be hosting an office hours review session at 3:30. And I will be covering a lot of this week's material heavily, weeks 6 and 7, as well as, lectures 6 and 7, as well as the marine life lecture that I'll be posting that same day, but I will make some time for general exam review. At the same time, in addition, on Wednesday, February 3rd, I will be releasing lecture 9, which is going to be entirely recap and review. So if you would like, you can hold off on starting the exam until after I release that. I'll be releasing that by Wednesday, possibly earlier if I have time. But it's good to know that that's happening, even if you do complete all of the new lecture material and go over the study guide and feel confident about it. I will be posting a recap and review lecture on Wednesday, February 3rd. And I will be hosting office hours that day too. I may do a more formal exam review during those office hours, but I am not quite sure yet. However, I will be around for office hours that day as well. Talking about today's new material, we're going to first talk about what Antarctica looked like during the age of dinosaurs, the Mesozoic, which began immediately after the Permian extinction and would continue until what is known as the dinosaur extinction, when an asteroid impact caused most dinosaurs along with a lot of other species to go extinct, and thus opened the door for mammals to diversify and evolve into the diversity of mammals we see today. We are still living in the age of mammals. And in the age of mammals, there's not that many mammals living in Antarctica, actually. We'll talk a little bit about what life on the land looks like in Antarctica today during the second part of this lecture, and you'll see that there's not very much. There's no land mammals living anymore. The largest animals that completely live on land, that don't rely on the ocean at all for food or shelter, are insects today, midges to be precise. And I'll talk more about them later. But dinosaurs did indeed roam Antarctica, as they did the other continents. At the last lecture, we ended up with the Permian mass extinction, which was a catastrophic die-off of life. Mostly marine life, actually, but land life was affected also, and that mass extinction appears to have been caused by excessive ocean acidification, likely from the excess release of carbon dioxide, not just from volcanic eruptions, but from those volcanic lava flows igniting coal that had been previously deposited. So that was the end of the Permian period and the Paleozoic era. The Mesozoic era includes the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. And dinosaurs first evolved near the very end of the Triassic period. The Triassic period was kind of an interesting experimental time in which a bunch of different lineages of organisms, most of them reptiles, radiated to fill the roles left behind by the Synapsids, which did not completely go extinct during the Permian extinction. Mammals are descended from Synapsids and were mammals, but they heavily declined. Relatively few of them lived past the Permian extinction, and those that did survive declined in diversity until the end of the period. But some true mammals did evolve at the end of the period and did survive and would eventually diversify much more once most dinosaurs were wiped out. But not just dinosaurs evolved during this time. Crocodiles and turtles also evolved during the Triassic period. And it's kind of interesting because a bunch of reptiles evolved during the Triassic that competed with dinosaurs and were mostly outcompeted and rendered extinct by dinosaurs by the end of the period. Crocodiles and turtles, some of the other reptiles that showed up during the Triassic, occupied different niches. Dinosaurs didn't really go in the water all that much, a handful of exceptions aside, and mammals survived because they mostly lived at night and were occupying roles like insect eater or scavenger or browsing on little plants or eating rotten stuff that dinosaurs weren't really bothering with. And very few mammals would even grow larger than beavers until after most dinosaurs went extinct. Dinosaurs were most diverse during the Jurassic period. The movie Jurassic Park, I think, was named as such because of that, even though most of the specific dinosaurs shown are actually from the later Cretaceous period. Dinosaurs diversified into many of the more famous types, like the long-necked dinosaurs, Brachiosaurus and Apatosaurus, as well as armored plant eaters like Stegosaurus, and also meat-eating dinosaurs like Allosaurus, but also birds. The first dinosaurs that closely resemble birds appeared near the very end of the Jurassic, and that would be the only lineage of dinosaurs to survive the asteroid extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. And dinosaurs would continue to thrive throughout the Cretaceous, but they would decline near the end, and then they would be rendered extinct by the asteroid impact, aside from the birds. The Cretaceous period is kind of a bridge of sorts between the dinosaur era and the modern era because flowering plants showed up for the first time. The Cretaceous is when plant landscapes begin to at least vaguely start to look like modern landscapes, because you don't just have conifers, pine trees and their relatives, and cycads anymore. You have actual flowering plants. So what does this mean for Antarctica? Well, I will say that throughout this lecture, there's going to be some moments when Antarctica gets emphasized more heavily and some less so, because our fossil record of Antarctica is pretty sparse. But in the Triassic, Antarctica was still part of Pangaea. But even though Pangaea continued to exist, it was a very different world from the Permian. If you remember, I described that the Permian period was actually the last time that Antarctica, or really anywhere on Earth, had ice caps until the ice age that we're presently living in. So throughout the Mesozoic, throughout the dinosaur era, there was no ice in Antarctica and not really any permanent ice anywhere on Earth. But Pangaea was still together. As life recovered after the Permian extinction, it entered a different world. The Earth's climate had warmed quite a bit, and this actually caused a different iteration of the continental effect, because you have this large land mass and there's a lot of interior land far from the ocean. If it's hot, if the world is hot overall, that leads to extreme desert temperatures like you see in the Great Basin of Nevada or Utah today. So Earth was largely covered in arid grass didn't exist yet, but scrubland and sparse forest, not rainforest, not a lot of rainfall except near the poles. Antarctica actually was relatively temperate compared to the rest of this. It was fairly cool and got more rain, but it still didn't have any ice. It was, as you can see, it was close to the South Pole, but not as close. And Australia and Antarctica are about as close to the South Pole as Australia and Antarctica are joined, and they're both about as far south as each other. You'll notice Antarctica is also still attached to India. Africa is still firmly attached to South America, so there's no Atlantic Ocean. What this meant was that animals that evolved could actually spread across the continents quite easily, and fossils from the Triassic are found often across widely separated oceans, which, as I'll talk about further, and as I mentioned before, was a key bit of evidence for the hypothesis of continental drift. And relatively few Antarctic rocks are actually known from the late Triassic. No dinosaurs from the Triassic have been found in Antarctica, but dinosaurs did evolve near the end of the Triassic, and we believe they might have existed in Antarctica, given that they're found throughout most of the rest of the world. The fossil record from the Triassic and Antarctica is just kind of poor. But they have found some actually mammal ancestors in Antarctica from the Triassic, and I'll talk about those next. But speaking of those mammal ancestors, the synapsids, which had been the dominant land animals during the Permian, they did not go completely extinct, but they declined drastically. Fewer of them survived, they were less diverse, and they began to be outcompeted by reptiles that thrived in the warmer climate. Reptiles like Postosuchus here, which is not a dinosaur, but it looks like a large hunting crocodile, and that's kind of what it was. It's not actually part of the modern crocodile group either, but it's related to dinosaurs and crocodiles. And it's one of a number of reptile lineages that exploded in diversity during the Triassic, and it's one of those that went extinct at the end of the Triassic as dinosaurs took over. The dinosaurs were really just one lineage that evolved to take advantage of this drier world. Dinosaurs would dominate the rest of the Mesozoic. A few other groups survived. Crocodiles survived. The pterosaurs, which are often referred to as the flying dinosaurs, even though they're not technically dinosaurs, also survived, as would the first mammals. Something else I want to notice is that this is from another episode of Walking with Dinosaurs that depicts the Triassic period. And they film them in real world locations, and there's going to be some flowering plants in here, but they filmed this actually in New Caledonia, where there are a lot of ancient conifers still living. And it's meant to look sort of like a Triassic scrubland in that it's dominated by plants that would look like modern junipers and ponderosa pines, which are modern day conifers that survive very well in dry environments. Pine trees are kind of waxy, so they don't lose water as badly. Same with cycads, which are these plants that look vaguely like palm trees but make a little cone in the middle. Cycads and conifers were the dominant plant life for much of the Mesozoic, and some people actually think that dinosaurs declined when flowering plants began to replace them near the end of the Cretaceous, and dinosaurs were not as well adapted to eating flowering plants. But I'm getting sidetracked there. So I mentioned that no dinosaurs have been found in Antarctica from the Triassic, but one mammal ancestor has. Lystrasaurus, which was a therapsid or a transitional synapsid between being, well, not quite a mammal, but related to them. And Lystrasaurus has been found not only in Antarctica, it was actually one of the first vertebrate species described from Antarctica, but it's also been found in India, as well as Madagascar and southern Africa, which we now know were attached to Antarctica during the Triassic period as part of Pangaea. And not, as you might have read in the article that I had you read, it was an herbivore. It may or may not have been a hippo. It may or may not have lived in rivers semi-aquatically the way that a hippo does now. A hippo feeds in the water and spends time there, but doesn't breed there and does have to go on land still. And this animal laid eggs, so it had to go on land to do that still. But it lived in a relatively swampy environment, at least. There were lots of plants, and that makes it clear to us that there were plants in Antarctica during this time. There were swamps and scrublands and even forests in Antarctica during this time. Another mammal, so Lystrasaurus is one of a couple of different types of synapsids that lived into the Triassic. It's part of a group called the Decynodonts, which you don't need to remember. But the Decynodonts are actually not the ancestors of us and modern mammals. They died out at the end of the Triassic. A more successful group of synapsids was a group called the Cynodonts, represented here by an animal called Synognathus. It's not found in Antarctica, but it has been found on either side of the Atlantic Ocean and was part of the fossil evidence that convinced people that the Atlantic Ocean had not always existed, that the rocks on either side had once been joined. And it does not look nearly as much like, I don't think it looked nearly as much like a mammal as this artist's impression does. This really makes them look like tigers, but it was part of the lineage that did eventually evolve into us modern mammals. And there is a very good chance they were warm-blooded, although that wasn't necessarily especially useful during this time because the Earth as a whole was warm and that benefited reptiles and other cold-blooded animals well. But as we know now, the warm-bloodedness would later come quite in handy. But let's talk about the dinosaurs, because the Triassic period is one of the three sort of constituent time periods of the Mesozoic era, but dinosaurs only show up near the very end. The first undisputed dinosaur is Eoraptor, which means dawn lizard, and it's known from a part of Gondwana land that is now in Argentina. And quite a few early dinosaur fossils are known from Argentina, actually. Not just Eoraptor, but Stordicosaurus and Herrerasaurus and a bunch of other early dinosaur ancestors. And it vaguely resembles later predatory two-legged dinosaurs like Coelophysis, Compsognathus, or larger ones like Allosaurus and Tyrannosaurus. Those are all part of a clade of dinosaurs called the Saurischians, not something you need to memorize unless you find this especially interesting. But there is another clade of dinosaurs, the Ornithischians, which includes Triceratops, Stegosaurus, and most plant-eating dinosaurs. The one exception to that is that lawn-necked dinosaurs are actually, even though they eat plants, they're related to the meat-eating dinosaurs. But the interesting thing is that Eoraptor looks like one of the two-legged meat-eating dinosaurs, but it has features in common with these plant-eating dinosaurs also, with the Ornithischians, like Triceratops. And it's believed to be very close to a common ancestor of all dinosaurs, because even with the two clades of dinosaurs, they all did come from a common ancestor. They have features in common, which you can learn more about if you do ever want to take dinosaurs, by the way. That class lingers on this much more than this one does. But dinosaurs radiated all over the world, and by the end of the late Triassic, they were the dominant land animals and were found on every continent except for Australia and Antarctica. Why have they not been found on Australia and Antarctica from the Triassic period? A couple possible reasons. One is that they just weren't there. They hadn't radiated there yet. I find that a little unlikely because the first dinosaurs show up in South America, and South America was relatively closely attached to Australia and Antarctica. The whole world was mostly attached, so it was not that hard to migrate. So I believe I would not be surprised if there are some dinosaur fossils in both Australia and Antarctica. Just the fossil record is poor. And Australia has a better fossil record than we do, but there's not a lot of Triassic rocks exposed there. And in Antarctica, it's just covered in ice. We will learn about a couple of specific dinosaurs from later times in the Age of Dinosaurs that have been found. But regardless of whether they were found in Antarctica or not, dinosaurs were all over the place by the end of the Triassic, and they outcompeted the vast majority of the other lineages like Postosuchus, which you saw before. And The only dinosaurs were the dominant terrestrial, meaning land-based animals. The couple of other reptile lineages that survived were like the pterosaurs. You might know them as pterodactyls, which flew, or crocodiles, which swam. And mammals survived mostly because a couple of synapsids evolved to fill niches or evolutionary roles that dinosaurs did not. The first true mammals appear right around the boundary between the Triassic and the Jurassic, and they're studying their bones and their teeth indicates to us that they were probably mostly all nocturnal, actually as many mammals are today. Most of them were smaller than a beaver, if even smaller than that. This animal was about as big as a shrew or a bull today, like a little mouse, even though it was not a true mouse at all. And they ate insects at night or fed on rotting vegetation or fed on carcasses or just kind of ate whatever. And dinosaurs didn't really fill those roles. They sort of filled roles that dinosaurs wouldn't take, and that's how they avoided going completely extinct until when most dinosaurs were wiped out and they were able to re-radiate to fill those roles. This is Morganucodon, which, depending on who you ask, is either one of the most advanced synapsids or one of the earliest mammals. I will say that actually a few synapsids that were not mammals did survive as long as the Cretaceous. They were also quite like this and looked like furry mammals. But today, the only surviving synapsids are the true mammals. And we won't talk about mammals that much in the Mesozoic. They were actually a lot more diverse than people realized, but their fossils are not that well known because they were small and they've been kind of understudied compared to dinosaurs. But there are actually a lot of really interesting mammals from the Mesozoic era. But let's talk about dinosaurs, because we do actually know of a handful of dinosaurs that are not birds. That's what I mean by non-avian, that are found from Antarctica. So the Jurassic period begins immediately after the Triassic, and we do actually start to find dinosaur fossils in Antarctica starting in the early Jurassic. And that might have to do with the fact that that was when dinosaurs had become more abundant and more definitively dominant. And so we start having a greater chance of finding their fossils. So we haven't found a lot of fossils because the vast majority of the rock that might hold fossils in Antarctica is hidden under ice. However, we have managed to find a few fossils in the Antarctic Peninsula, in the Transantarctic Mountains, and in some of the surrounding islands where there is exposed rock. And the interesting thing about Antarctic dinosaurs is that we have found a decent number of fossils that have not yet been described. And describing is when you study a fossil and formally publish a scientific journal article on what it is, and you give it a name officially. So we have a lot of fossils in Antarctica that are often really jumbled and in poor condition, and they've never been described or named. The funny thing to me is that Antarctopelta, which is one of the three I'll talk about, was actually the first dinosaur ever found in Antarctica back in the 1980s, but it was not formally described until the early 2000s, over 20 years later. So one of the earliest dinosaurs known from Antarctica is Cryolophosaurus, which this is actually what the holotype or what the original specimen looked like. And it's jumbled, as you can see, but it was complete enough for them to realize that it was a pretty large meat-eating dinosaur, probably distantly related to Allosaurus, and that it also had a crest on its head that it might have used for mating displays. Now, it would not have lived in an environment that looked anything like this, and this is what I'm saying when I mean that you have to be careful in separating the place where a rock is found today, aka in this frigid, icy wasteland of the Transantarctic Mountains, and where the sediments that form these rocks were deposited. These were originally river or lake rocks, or lake sediments in a forested environment where dinosaurs lived. And this was the only dinosaur with a name for a very, very long time. However, it was a meat eater, so obviously it must have had probably plant-eating dinosaurs to prey upon. And another dinosaur was eventually also described from the early Jurassic that is a plant eater. That's actually an early long-necked dinosaur, the group that includes more famous genera like Apatosaurus, Brachiosaurus, and Diplodocus. And this was Glacialosaurus was a pretty primitive example. It's very similar to a lot of the other, there were primitive long-necked dinosaurs showing up at the end of the Triassic, and it looks a lot like them. And that suggests that its ancestors were already present in Antarctica by long before it itself existed. We just haven't found their fossils. And it may very well have coexisted with Cryolophosaurus or its relatives and been preyed upon by them. And also, it wasn't as huge as any of the more classic ones are known, but it was still it still stood about as tall as a human, and it had to have been able to survive on plant life. More evidence that Antarctica had abundant plant life to support these dinosaur communities. It is the third dinosaur ever described from Antarctica. And it's actually not even the only long-necked dinosaur known. This little Glacialosaurus is this big specimen here, and you'll notice there's a little model built next to it, and that is an as yet undescribed specimen of what they believe is also another smaller long-necked dinosaur, also from Antarctica. So there's a lot of fossils from Antarctica that have not been given scientific names. It's not just that they've only found 3 dinosaurs, there've only been 3 dinosaurs that have been formally described and given a name. Now, not all dinosaurs in Antarctica lived at the same time. The dinosaur era encompasses 3 separate periods of geologic history, and the Triassic starts 200-something million years. That goes to 65 million years. 65 million years was the end of the Cretaceous period, and here is one of the Antarctic dinosaurs that lived during the Cretaceous period. Antarctopelta, which was actually the first dinosaur fossil ever found in Antarctica on James Ross Island on the peninsula, but it was not described until the 2000s. Something to keep in mind, James Ross Island is completely different from quote-unquote Ross Island, which is infuriating, but Ross Island is in East Antarctica, in the Ross Sea, and it's where McMurdo Base is. James Ross Island is in the peninsula. They're named after the same person, but that doesn't help anything at all. But anyway, this is found in the peninsula. There are rocks from the Cretaceous exposed in the peninsula, and as I mentioned, the peninsula is warmer than the rest of Antarctica and has a bit more exposed rock. And it appears to have been very similar to Ankylosaurus, which is an armored dinosaur that had bony nodules in its skin, as well as a club at the end of its tail that it could have used for protection. And the Ankylosaurus lived alongside Tyrannosaurus rex, and it's often shown fighting Tyrannosaurus rex. We haven't had any Tyrannosaurus-like animals described from Antarctica yet. Actually, there was a completely different group of large carnivores called the Abelisaurs that lived in the southern continents. It's very likely that there were Abelisaurs in Antarctica, just we haven't really found them or described them yet. But there were large carnivorous dinosaurs preying on this as well. Something that happened in the middle of the dinosaur era, near the end of the Jurassic period, is that we began to see the end of Pangaea. Pangaea began to break up in the Jurassic period, and the Cretaceous period globe would end up looking a lot closer to what the Earth does today. You would start to see more separate continents forming. And in the early Jurassic, you can already see that the northern continents are starting to drift away more. The southern continents are still mostly united in Gondwana, but by the end of the Jurassic, this would come to an end. By the end of the Jurassic, Africa would be completely rifted away from Antarctica. And that was part of an episode known as the Farrar Complex, as the Farrar episodes. The rocks produced by this are known as the Farrar basalts. And what happened was that a new spreading center, like the one that's in the Great Rift Valley today, formed on land. And it developed along the boundary of what's now Antarctica and Africa, and rifting and volcanism separated the continents, eventually allowing an ocean to flow in between them. And there was so much volcanism that it produced these large swathes of basalt that just covered everything. And you can still see them. You can see in this upper left example how my field area is the granite down here near the lake bed and these black lampropheres found down there. Going up means that you're going to younger rocks, and you can see that there's just this black layer of rock covering everything, and that's from the Farrar Complex. That's from the Farrar rifting event. And they have actually found similar rocks in southern Africa that are correlated to these, that are basically the other side of the rift. And this is actually when the Transantarctic Mountains first began to form, because they were uplifted partially as a result of this rifting episode. And the cool thing about this is that mid-ocean ridge that formed during the Jurassic is still there to this very day. Antarctica is surrounded by spreading centers, I mentioned before, and one of those is out in the Indian Ocean and continuing to push Africa away from Antarctica to this very day. And remember, Antarctica and Africa have a long geologic history. The oldest rocks in Antarctica are really similar to some found in southern Africa, but Antarctica has been separated by rifting from Africa since the middle of the dinosaur age. Now, during the Cretaceous period, Pangaea was no more. Gondwana still existed, but you'll notice that there is an Atlantic Ocean starting to form between South America and Africa by this point, and that there are shallow seas separating some of the southern continents, and these seas would come and go. There would be, depending on sea level, there would intermittently be connections between South America and Antarctica, as well as Antarctica and India until India began to drift northward. Australia and Antarctica would essentially remain the same continent for quite a while, though. And Australia and Antarctica were both quite closer to the South Pole by this point. Because Australia extended far enough north, there was no Antarctic circumpolar current. So even though Antarctica did partially lay over the South Pole at this point, it wasn't quite as cold. Global climates were also not quite as cold. There was no permanent ice cap in Antarctica still. But so this meant that it was actually a lot more possible for life to exist near the poles. In the North Pole, they have found dinosaur fossils in northern Canada and Alaska. Edmontosaurus, named after the city of Edmonton, is found in both those areas. And in the South Pole, dinosaur fossils are actually known extensively from Australia. And since Australia and Antarctica were connected, it seems quite likely that a lot of the dinosaurs in Australia that actually experienced polar night also lived in Antarctica as well. Vast forests covered Australia as well as Antarctica, and herds of dinosaurs lived in them. But like Antarctica does now, since it was far south enough, they experienced some degree of polar night during the winter. There were periods when the sun didn't shine. And this has been going on even during periods when the Earth was warmer. It's good to consider that the tilt of Earth's axis causes areas close enough to the South Pole to be under polar night for part of the year. As a side note, you also do have to consider that Earth's axis, the tilt has varied over the years, and some people think that the polar dinosaurs may have been able to survive because the tilt was less pronounced during this time, and it made the polar night a bit less long and less extreme. But what would happen in the parts of Australia and Antarctica that were experiencing polar night was that plants would go dormant and many dinosaurs would simply migrate. But some smaller dinosaurs and some carnivorous dinosaurs appear to have hung around for the winter, and that is good evidence that most dinosaurs were warm-blooded by this time. We know that most carnivorous dinosaurs almost certainly were, looking at their bone structure and also just looking at the evolutionary similarities between their descendants, birds, and fossil carnivorous dinosaurs. But the fact that so many of them survived in an area that did at least get cold in the winter indicates that some of them could survive the cold, at least better than other reptiles. And the funny thing is that many of the famous raptors like Deinonychus and Velociraptor had feathers and were closely related to birds. So it's not that surprising that dinosaurs were warm-blooded. They're related to modern organisms that are warm-blooded and, as penguins indicate, can survive in cold environments in some cases. Before too long, I'd like you to view the episode of Walking with Dinosaurs called Spirits of the Ice Forest that I have posted on Gaucho Space. It is mostly based on Australian animals, but that same biotic community likely was very similar to what lived in Antarctica at the time, given the land bridge. And it kind of imagines how dinosaurs might have survived the polar night. And one cool thing about it is that it highlights an animal that managed to survive in this unique ecosystem long after its relatives died out. Before crocodiles evolved, the most dominant swimming predators were large amphibians, like this animal, Coolissuchus. Coolissuchus was one of the last surviving animals of its kind. By the Cretaceous period, its relatives had been outcompeted by crocodiles elsewhere, but crocodiles could not survive in this cold water. Now, Coolissuchus could survive the cold winter because the same way that many frogs do today, some frogs found in Siberia and Alaska, they can kind of freeze and exist in suspended animation for the winter. And people think Coolissuchus might have been able to do this also. So that's kind of mid-Cretaceous. Let's kind of walk towards the end of the Cretaceous period and what started to happen. By the end of the Cretaceous, the continents had separated further. In general, since sea level was quite higher than it is today, many areas were covered by shallow seas, like this interior seaway that covered much of central North America. If you go to a place like Utah and hear about marine reptile fossils from there, that's because much of it was covered by an ocean during the late Cretaceous period. The continents had come closer to their periods, had come closer to their current location by the end of this period. You can see that the Atlantic Ocean has gotten wider. India is now on its way north, and it will eventually join the rest of Asia and have a collision that'll produce the Himalayas, but not for a while, but you can see it's starting to head that way. And Africa has continued to drift farther away from Antarctica. South America was now only intermittently connected with Antarctica. We know that Antarctica and South America would remain connected on and off for a while because they have found bird and mammal species on both continents, but it appears to have kind of come and gone over the years. And dinosaurs continued to exist. They became, in some cases, they began to exhibit what's known as endemism. And endemism is when one type of creature or organism only lives on one island or one continent. And you started to see lineage of dinosaurs like one that I briefly alluded to before, the abelisaurs. You don't need to remember them, but just as Tyrannosaurus and its relatives were the main meat eaters on the northern continents, they were a completely separate lineage of dinosaurs that dominated the southern continents. And you saw more divisions like that in the Cretaceous period. Now, near the end of the Cretaceous period, another massive episode of volcanism, similar to what happened in Siberia at the end of the Permian period, took place. It was not quite as extreme. It wasn't quite as big an area. It covers a large area of Western India and is known as the Deccan Traps today. They also don't appear to have ignited coal to the same extreme that the Permian eruptions did, but it still produced a lot of carbon dioxide and caused some ocean acidification. And near the end of the Cretaceous, before the big extinction, dinosaurs declined, as did many marine reptiles and ammonites, which are the sort of nautilus-like tentacled creatures you sometimes see swimming alongside marine reptiles. And the flying animals, the flying reptiles, the pterosaurs started to go extinct. And dinosaurs, it's interesting to think about the fact that dinosaurs there's a chance that more of them might have survived if this had not been going on, if the volcanism had not started to reduce their numbers and their diversity prior to the end of the Cretaceous. But regardless, an asteroid impact happened. Almost all dinosaurs were killed off when an exceptionally large asteroid struck an area that's now partially off the Yucatan Peninsula and partially on it. The impact is preserved, much of it underwater, and it's known as the Chicxulub crater today. And it wasn't, like many things, it was not identified until scientists were able to get a more complete picture of what was underwater. They had found a trough and these sinkholes that seemed to indicate some kind of big depression, and they were able to trace it out to the ocean and discover that there was a trough that looked like a giant impact crater found offshore also. And what they found was that, for one thing, this indicated that if this was indeed an asteroid, it had been a big eruption. They found rocks in the area that indicated that there had been an impact. There's a type of rock called tektite that forms when the Earth's crust is rapidly melted on impact by a meteor or by an asteroid, and then rapidly cools again in the air. So they found these tektites, and they can date those, and they discovered that this impact was 65 million years old. Something else they discovered was iridium. Iridium is an element that's a heavy metal. It's very uncommon on Earth, but it is much more abundant in asteroids. And they discovered that around the world, rock beds included a spike of iridium at 65 million years. So this indicated that this asteroid this asteroid impact had been large enough to release a ridiculous amount of debris into the air, possibly enough to block out a significant amount of sunlight for several years. What would this have done? This would have caused a plant die-off. Trees, you're going to have some more simple plants can deal with reduced sunlight, but trees are going to die off. They might come back when their seeds regrow later, but generally, dinosaurs couldn't just dig seeds up. With the leaves all gone, the large herbivorous dinosaurs like Triceratops and Ankylosaurus that even if they survived the initial impact, they had nothing to eat afterwards with the mass plant die-off, and large herbivores all went extinct. Large carnivores, like Tyrannosaurus, then had no plant eaters to feed on, and they also went extinct. In general, large animals died off. The large marine reptiles died off, the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles died off. A lot of sea life also died off. It was not affected as heavily as during the Permian period, but some groups that had already been in decline, probably because of the eruptions from the Deccan traps, they completely disappeared. Mammals survived as a group. Mammals were mostly pretty small, and a lot of them fed on insects or just kind of ate anything, and so a good number of them were able to weather this devastation, as did some small birds and crocodiles, which, like I said, aquatic life was not quite as heavily affected, so some crocodiles were able to live. But this was a turning point in Earth's history, because it just completely took out all of the large animals on Earth, essentially. And it left kind of a lot of little things that we'd look at today, like sort of trash animals, like rat-like creatures, to fill it in. And those largely rat and rodent-like mammals that were mostly all mammals did during the dinosaur era, well, when they were given the chance, they evolved into the vast diversity of lineages of mammals we have today. Elephants and true carnivores like dogs and cats, and hoofed animals and whales, those have all diversified since the extinction of the dinosaurs. Some of their ancestors can be traced back to the dinosaur age, but the vast diversity of mammals is something that emerged after this impact destroyed their competitors, destroyed the large dinosaurs. And that brings us into what's known as the Cenozoic age. And that means recent life, and that's accurate because we are still living in the Cenozoic age. It's also known as the age of mammals, and it goes from the end of the dinosaur extinction to the present day. And climate-wise, the Cenozoic has been characterized by a cooling of the Earth. If you look at this, you can see that global temperatures were quite warm at the start of during the Paleocene and the Eocene epochs. And epochs, remember, are kind of the smallest interval of time we use. We can do them more when we have a better fossil record and can differentiate fossils and rocks better. But it was quite warm at the start of the Cenozoic, but it would get cooler and cooler and cooler. Antarctica, by this point, even by the Eocene, Antarctica started to develop more seasons. Antarctica would be 25 degrees in the summer versus 2 degrees in the winter, even in its more temperate parts. But the cooling actually would largely benefit mammals and birds because they were endothermic or warm-blooded and didn't really have an issue dealing with the cold climates. That would not save them in Antarctica, where it just became too cold for any plant life to exist, but it has meant that mammals have been able to live in environments like the ocean, where that's how warm-blooded whales survive, or the Arctic, where a lot of mammal lineages do survive, or up in the mountains. But there was sort of an Eocene explosion of mammal diversity, kind of like how at the start of the Cambrian, most of the modern lineages of life showed up. Most of the modern lineages of mammals that we know today, like horses or primates or true carnivores or whales or elephants, we see their earliest versions showing up in the Eocene epoch. And the Eocene of Antarctica was a different place from the dinosaur era of Antarctica. It had forests, but it had different forests. It actually had forests that kind of vaguely resemble what you would see in the eastern United States today. The dominant plant was Nothofagus, which is a flowering plant that's today actually found in New Caledonia and in New Zealand, which were both remnants of the Zealandia subcontinent, as well as in Australia. And fossils clearly belonging to Nothofagus, which has been around for quite a long time, they find them in Antarctica, even though there's no forest in Antarctica today. Look at how kind of narrow and jagged the leaf is. That's kind of meant as an adaptation for cold climates. It means that it loses heat less quickly. And it would also lose its leaves during the winter, the same way that trees in Vermont do today. So Antarctica would have kind of looked like Vermont. You would have had green forests in the summer, and then the leaves would turn other colors and fall off in the winter, and you would have bare forests for much of the winter. But you would also have rodents and horses and other early mammals living alongside it. So even though we don't have any land mammals living in Antarctica today, in the early part of the age of mammals, as mammals proliferated, quite a few did indeed live on the southern continent. So aside from horses, they've described a small handful of mammals genre from Antarctica from the early part of the age of mammals. And a lot of them don't have any surviving relatives today. Antarctica is now too icy for anything like this to live, but Antarctica had a number of plant-eating mammals that lived in these forests and browsed on vegetation, and that resemble mammals found in South America in many cases. South America and Antarctica would continue to have intermittent connection through the early part of the age of mammals, and so there's one genus known as Sudamerica, which literally means South America, that is actually known both from Patagonia and from Antarctica. And it's a plant-eating mammal that's not clearly related to anything else. It's part of a group called the Gondwanatheres, and we're not quite sure where they fit in. There's another group, Antarctodon, which you saw before, that is a distant relative of hoofed mammals, but not that closely related to gazelles or anything like that. It's distantly related to them. So these guys and the horses indicate that there was still plenty of plant life to eat, but since this was so far back, the mammals in Antarctica were present during the early evolution of during the early radiation of mammals. As the age of mammals progressed, it would become too cold for much plant life to exist there, and these communities of mammals and reptiles and plants would completely just disappear, which is kind of sad to think about in a way. But a group that would be more lucky were the penguins. So the earliest penguin, some fossils resembling penguins are actually known from the Mesozoic, from Antarctica as well as New Zealand. But some animals that are definitely penguins actually show up in the Eocene epoch in 37 million years. And these penguins were larger than modern day penguins, possibly because there was more food, but they had already developed flightlessness and they were already evolved for swimming. And they coexisted alongside land mammals, but one reason they may have been luckier is because, as we'll talk about, the oceans support much more life in Antarctica than does the land today. And penguins were able to survive because they evolved to feed off ocean animals before Antarctica completely became an icy wasteland. So that's why penguins are still there. Actually, dinosaurs have actually had one of the longest and most consistent presences in Antarctica, because dinosaurs first appear in Antarctica in the Jurassic, and they were probably there in the Triassic too. And dinosaurs evolve into birds evolve into penguins in Antarctica, in the southern continents, and penguins live in Antarctica to this very day. So we still have dinosaurs in Antarctica, and we've had them there for quite a long time, which I think is really cool, actually. One thing I will say is that even though penguins are flightless, they evolved flightlessness separately from ostriches and emus and the other long-necked flightless birds you might know about. And that's an example of convergent evolution, when two not that closely related groups of animals evolve the same trait. In this case, most birds can fly, but a couple of separate groups of birds have lost their ability to fly. Ostriches and emus did so they could focus on running. Penguins did so they can swim. Penguins are one of the best adapted aquatic birds on the entire planet. And like I said, they were some of the only survivors of the isolation of Antarctica and the development of these gateways. The Earth was already getting colder, and the Earth was already getting colder from a combination of Milankovitch cycles, mostly, and plate tectonics. Antarctica, though, would become ridiculously cold when the Antarctic circumpolar current first opened up. South America would finally separate for good from Antarctica, and the modern-day Drake Passage would form. Australia was the final continent to separate from Antarctica. It had more or less completely separated by 30 million years, and that opened up another gateway, known as the Tasman Sea today. And with the separation complete, the Antarctic circumpolar current developed, encircling the now unbroken ocean around the continent and isolating Antarctica from warm ocean currents, and accelerating its development into a cold, icy wasteland on land. And even though glaciers began to form during the Oligocene epoch, the first time glaciers had existed since the Permian period, before the dinosaurs evolved, not all of the continent was covered by glaciers immediately, but it happened pretty fast. We do find fossil evidence of some surviving forests and little refugia where there were still some mammals into the late Oligocene, but eventually those just completely disappeared. And we don't have any such refuges today. Antarctica has no forests and no real plant coverage to speak of. If Antarctica isn't covered in ice, it looks like this. It looks like bare rock because there aren't any plants to make soil, and there's very little life on land anymore. Life is limited to a small handful of plants, lichens, a few invertebrates, and then some microbes. We'll talk more about the marine life that lives in Antarctica on the next lecture, Lecture 8, but the smaller second part of this lecture will go over the small terrestrial biodiversity that does still exist in Antarctica, even after the formation of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current and the overall freezing of the continent. And that's where we'll pick up.